Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some tougher stuff today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at the British Empire, but specifically some of the, shall we say, less glamorous parts they don't always put in the textbooks,
Yeah, it's definitely an area where, the historical record can be, well, pretty brutal.
to say the least, right? And we've got some excerpts from this text, actually originally in Spanish, which I thought was interesting, and it really digs into some lesser-known events, moments of real cruelty and injustice, the kind of stuff that makes you question, well, everything. A little bit. You're up for it.
Absolutely. I think these stories, even the tough ones, they need to be told.
Okay, then let's jump right in. First up, we got to talk about the Irish potato famine. Now, I know a lot of folks have heard of it, but man, when you actually get into the details, well, let's just say it's not exactly light dinner conversation. So we're talking 1845, Ireland's under British rule, and their main food source, the potato, it just and fails. Widespread crop failure. Can you even imagine? Your staple food gone, just like that.
Yeah. And it's not just the famine itself, right? It's how the British government reacted, or maybe more accurately, didn't react, that really adds another layer of tragedy to the whole thing.
Oh, totally. Like there was this attitude among some officials, right?
Yeah.
That the famine, it was some kind of divine punishment,
Mhm.
like a natural correction or something.
Exactly. This whole laissez-faire approach was pretty common at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, the whole let the market sort it out, even if, people are starving in the streets. And like, we're talking about Charles Trevelyan here, right? This
Yeah.
high-ranking official who really pushed that hands-off approach. It's chilling when you think about it. 1 million people died, millions more had to flee their homes, and there were people in power who saw it all as inevitable.
It really makes you think about the dangers of ideology, Even with what someone might see as good intentions, it can really blind you to the very real human cost of inaction.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And when you picture it, those Irish farmers out there working land that's no longer giving them food, families torn apart because immigration was their only option.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking, and it's a part of history that, well, it still casts a long shadow.
No doubt. And unfortunately, it's not the only one. We should probably talk about the Atlantic slave trade next, right? I mean, Britain wasn't the only one involved, obviously, but their role in it, well, let's just say it was significant, to put it mildly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we're not talking about some small-scale operation here. This went on for centuries. Can you believe that? From John Hawkins's first voyage back in 1562, the whole thing just kept growing and growing.
Ships leaving British ports loaded with goods to be traded for human beings, then sailing to the Americas where those enslaved people were forced into just unimaginable brutality on plantations. The scale of it is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It's mind-boggling, honestly. And think about the Middle Passage. That journey across the Atlantic was so often deadly in itself.
Absolutely. We're talking about millions of Africans ripped from their homes, subjected to horrific conditions, disease, violence, and it's all driven by, well, greed, plain and simple.
It really makes you question human nature, doesn't it? And, it took until the 1830s for Britain to finally abolish slavery in most of their colonies.
Which, let's be honest, that didn't erase the centuries of damage that had already been done.
Right. The ripple effects of that are still felt today. And speaking of ripple effects, we got to talk about the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. So, after World War II, the British Empire, it's starting to crumble, right?
Yeah.
And India is a prime example of that. Like, they realize they can't hold on to it anymore, but things are already getting really tense.
So the decisions made to partition India, right, create two separate states, India and Pakistan, sounds simple enough on paper, maybe, but the execution, that's where things get really messy.
Messy might be the understatement of the century. They brought in this guy, Cyril Radcliffe, to draw the border, and seriously, the poor guy was given hardly any time, like no resources to speak of, and the result, well, it's a recipe for disaster.
And disaster is exactly what happened. The border Radcliffe drew paid almost no attention to the existing religious and ethnic groups living in those areas. It's like they were just asking for conflict.
And conflict is exactly what they got. Think about this. 30 million people displaced, their entire lives uprooted because someone drew a line on a map.
It really shows you the dangers of rushing into these huge geopolitical decisions without considering the very real human cost.
And the violence that followed. Yeah, it's just unfathomable. Villages burned, people massacred just because of how this whole thing was handled.
It's estimated that 500,000 people died in the violence that followed the partition. 500,000. It's just staggering.
It's infuriating, to think about how much of that suffering could have been avoided if things have been handled differently.
And that disregard for the human cost, unfortunately, it's something we see again and again throughout history. Take the Boer Wars in South Africa, for instance.
I have to admit, that's one of those historical blind spots for me, the Boer Wars. What were they all about?
Well, basically, you've got these two wars, late 1800s to early 1900s, British against the Boers, who were descendants of Dutch settlers, and it's all about control, really. Control of land, resources, the usual.
Okay, and I'm sensing, knowing the British Empire, it probably wasn't exactly a fair fight.
Right. The British were determined to win, and they were willing to use some pretty brutal tactics to do it. And the thing that really gets to me, honestly, is their use of concentration camps.
Wait, hold on. Concentration camps. Like, this is way before World War II, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. The British rounded up huge numbers of Boers, mostly women and children, and put them in these camps. And the conditions were just awful. Overcrowding, disease, starvation, thousands died, so many of them kids. It's just really hard to read about even now.
God, it's like you see these echoes of some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Like, you'd think they would have learned from that kind of suffering. You'd hope. Anyway.
You'd like to think so, right? But yeah, it does seem like history has a way of, well, repeating itself. I think the Boer Wars are a really stark reminder that when you dehumanize your enemy, when you start seeing entire groups of people as expendable, it never, ever ends well.
It's grim, for sure. And unfortunately, I think we've got more grimness to come. We can't talk about this stuff without mentioning the Opium Wars. That's a whole other level of, like, profit over people, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The Opium Wars are a prime example of what happens when economic interests are the only thing that matter. You've got the British East India Company, driven by greed, pure and simple, flooding China with opium.
It's crazy, right? This substance, highly addictive, is already tearing Chinese society apart, but they just keep pushing it, all to make a quick buck. And the hypocrisy. The British Empire always going on about morality, about civilizing the world, but all the while, they're profiting off of this misery.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. The Opium Wars really expose that, that underbelly of empire, the lengths they were willing to go to protect their power, their wealth.
Yeah, and the effects of that exploitation.
Yeah.
They're still felt today in China, right? It's a heavy legacy, to say the least.
It really is.
It's like this pattern emerges, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Exploit, oppress, and then justify it all with fancy rhetoric about progress or whatever.
Yeah.
And speaking of oppression and justification, I think we have to talk about the Amritsar massacre in 1919. That's another event that, well, every time I read about it, it just sends chills down my spine.
Yeah, it's a dark, dark day in history. Just imagine, thousands of unarmed Indians are gathered peacefully in Amritsar to protest British rule. They had no idea what was coming.
Okay, now I'm really on edge. What happened?
So British troops, under the command of this Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, they surround the protesters. And then, without warning, they just open fire. Men, women, children just gunned down in this horrific act of violence. Hundreds are dead, maybe over 1,000. Estimates vary, and countless more are wounded. And you want to know the worst part?
Tell me.
General Dyer, the guy who gave the order, he never really faced any real consequences for what happened at Amritsar.
It's unbelievable. The lack of accountability is just, it's mind-boggling. The Amritsar massacre, it's a stain on, well, it's a stain on humanity if you ask me, but certainly on British history. And I think it just goes to show that those in power, they don't always answer for their crimes.
That's right. And I think that demand for justice, for acknowledgement, for real reconciliation, it's still very much alive today. Those wounds from the past, they don't just disappear,
No, they don't. It takes work to even begin to heal. But, okay, on that note, maybe let's shift gears a little bit, geographically speaking. I'm curious about the British expedition to Tibet in 1903. What was that all about?
Ah, Tibet. Well, to put it simply, it all boils down to strategic maneuvering and a healthy dose of fear, I think. Fear of the Russians, to be precise.
The Russians, okay, what were they up to in Tibet?
It was more about what the British thought they might be up to be honest. See, they just finished, shall we say, acquiring Burma and Sikkim, and they were paranoid about the Russians gaining a foothold in the region.
So Tibet, which posed no actual threat to them, became a target.
Pretty much. They saw Tibet as a potential Russian ally, and they weren't taking any chances. So they decided to assert their dominance. And, of course, they brought their superior firepower. We're talking machine guns, repeating rifles, the whole 9 yards. The Tibetan militia, armed mostly with swords and muskets, well, they didn't stand a chance.
Man, talk about an uneven playing field. It's like the British Empire had a playbook, right? identify a potential threat, even an imaginary one, and then just roll in with overwhelming force. So what was the outcome of this expedition?
Well, it was about as brutal and one-sided as you'd expect. The British marched right into Lhasa, the Tibetan capital, forced the Dalai Lama into hiding, and imposed a treaty that basically made Tibet another one of their protectorates. Just another notch on the belt of empire, achieved through bloodshed and intimidation.
It's a depressingly familiar story. But we're not done yet, right? We have to talk about Australia. The impact of British colonization on the Aboriginal population there, well, it's a story that needs to be told too.
Absolutely. The arrival of the British in Australia in 1788, it was a major turning point, and for the Aboriginal people who were already there, it marked the beginning of a long, very painful chapter in their history.
Yeah, from the little I know, it seems like the impact of colonization was pretty immediate and utterly devastating.
That's accurate. One of the first and most horrific things that happened was the introduction of European diseases. Smallpox, especially, ripped through Aboriginal communities because they had absolutely no immunity. Then came the forced displacement from their ancestral lands, the violence, the brutality. It's just awful.
The Mile Creek Massacre, that always comes to mind. Just horrific.
It's a prime example of the violence inflicted upon Aboriginal people. In 1838, a group of white settlers murdered 28 unarmed Aboriginal men, women, and children. The details are truly horrific. But what's interesting about Myall Creek is that despite attempts to cover it up, some of those settlers were actually brought to justice and hanged for their crimes. It was the first and only time in Australian history that white settlers were punished for massacring Aboriginal people.
Wow, the first and only time. I don't even know what to say to that.
I know, it's pretty shocking, right? And it just goes to show you that one instance of accountability, it doesn't come close to erasing centuries of systemic oppression and violence. The Myall Creek Massacre is just one of many, many atrocities, and the Aboriginal population was decimated. Their culture, their way of life, it was disrupted, destroyed in many cases, and the effects of that are still felt very strongly today. The legacy of colonization runs deep. And so we come to, well, our final stop on this deep dive into the darker side of the British Empire. Kenya in the 1950s, the Mau Uprising.
The fight for Kenyan independence. And I have to say, given what we've already uncovered, I'm not exactly expecting a happy ending here.
You'd be right to brace yourself. The Kenyans' desire for freedom was met with, well, let's just call it what it was: brutal repression. The British, they were terrified of a full-blown rebellion, and the way they responded, it was pretty horrific.
Okay, well, no time like the present to face uncomfortable truths, right?
Yeah.
Lay it on me. How bad are we talking?
Try to picture this.
Yeah.
1.5 million Kenyans rounded up, herded into these detention camps.
Detention camps.
Yeah, and get this, they called them work and freedom camps.
Work and freedom camps. Wow, that's some impressive doublespeak right there. I'm guessing the reality was anything but liberating.
You'd be 100% correct. The conditions in those camps, they were horrendous. We're talking forced labor, torture, extrajudicial killings, all tragically common. And we haven't even gotten to the whole other layer of horror, the widespread sexual violence.
God, it's just, you read about this stuff, you hear these stories, these echoes of colonial violence, and it's hard to even process it, that human beings could do these things to each other. And for what? To hold on to power, to maintain control. It doesn't make any sense.
It's senseless, truly. And it's almost more disturbing that even today, all these years later, we still don't know the true human cost of the Mau Uprising. The official British records, they downplay it, of course, claim the death toll was in the low thousands. But historians, they paint a much, much grimmer picture. They estimate that tens of thousands, maybe even more, lost their lives in that struggle.
Tens of thousands. It's impossible to grasp the scale of the suffering, all because of empire.
It's a heavy truth to carry, that's for sure. But I think facing those truths, acknowledging the injustices of the past, it's the only way we can even begin to understand the legacy of colonialism. And we can't shy away from that no matter how difficult it gets.
You're right. And, as we surface from this deep dive, I'm realizing it's not enough to just learn about these events, to be horrified by them. We have to do something with this knowledge, right?
Exactly. Knowledge without action, it's meaningless in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Right. So to everyone listening, think about this. How do you see these historical injustices playing out in the world today? What are the echoes of colonialism that we're still grappling with? And most importantly, what can we do, each of us, to challenge those legacies? How do we build a future where these kinds of atrocities are truly a thing of the past?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking. And there are no easy answers, but I think that's where the real work begins.
It's a lifelong journey, isn't it?
unlearning those harmful narratives, dismantling those systems of oppression when are, let's be honest, still with us in so many ways. It's not just about the past. It's about creating a better future. And on that note, I think it's time for us to come up for air. Thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a more just and equitable world. Take care, everyone.